Thank you.
I'm Gu-hyeon, a researcher of the SSK Research Cluster at GNU. Today, Professor Benanav of Syracuse University will give a presentation on the topic Post-Scarcity Economics. Thank you for accepting our invitation, Professor Benanav. It's a great pleasure to hear from you. Let me introduce Professor Benanav briefly. Benanav is a sociologist, economic historian, and assistant professor of sociology at Syracuse University. He also serves as a senior research associate at Syracuse University's Autonomous Systems Policy Institute. His first book, Automation and the Future of Work, which is translated in Korean, 자동화와 노동의 미래, appeared also in 2020. His writing has been featured in The Nation, Guardian, New Statesman, Boston Review, New Left Review, and Dissent. Benav's research interests include automation and the future of work, unemployment and underemployment, economic growth and development, critical theory, and alternative economic systems. Currently, Benav is working on two further book projects. One concerns the idea of post-scarcity economics, which is today's topic. The other examines the global history of unemployment since 1940. Before joining Syracuse University, Benav was a member of the Society of Fellows at the University of Chicago. He holds a PhD and a Master of Arts in History from the University of California, Los Angeles, and a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of Chicago. Benanav serves on the editorial boards of New Left Review and International Labor and Working Class History. Professor Benanav, you have 1 hour for presentation and it will be followed by 30 minutes of floor discussion. Professor Benanav, please start your talk.
Great. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Whoops. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Okay, so you can see the screen okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. So I'm just going to give an introduction to this new project I'm working on, which is about socialism. And the talk has a few parts. In the first part, I'm just going to talk about Marx and what Marx says about socialism and different ways to think about what he's emphasizing. And then the rest of the talk will be about some of my work on that topic. And the presentation doesn't have very many pictures in it, but I think in part because of the language barriers, you'll see that I'm just going to, a lot of what I say will be on the slides. So I hope that will, improve the ease of understanding what I'm saying. Okay, there we go. Okay, so first, just to start off, I emphasize that in Capital Volume 1, Marx provides a basic framework for thinking about a post-capitalist economy. He says in a famous line in the first chapter, let us finally imagine for a change an association of free men working with the means of production held in common and expending their many different forms of labor power in full self-awareness as one single social labor force. This free association, Marx emphasizes, would organize production in terms of investment on the one hand and consumption on the other hand. So he says the total product of our imagined association is a social product. One part of this product serves as fresh means of production, that is investment goods, and remains social. But another part is consumed by members of the association as means of subsistence. Marx explains that in this new society, labor time, but not market-validated socially necessary labor time, might play a double part in organizing production. On the one hand, its apportionment, so this labor time's apportionment in accordance with a definite social plan, maintains the correct proportion between different functions of labor and the various needs of the associations. In other words, Marx is saying planning will adjust supply to demand by reallocating individuals' labor time across groups of workers in lines with the changing needs of society. On the other hand, Marx says, labor time also serves as a measure of the part taken by each individual in the common labor and of his share in the part of the total product destined for individual consumption. So Marx is saying that people receive something like tokens based on the amount of time they work, and then they exchange these tokens for goods. But as many commentators have emphasized, these tokens are not circulating, they're not money, they're more like tickets to a theater. What are the advantages of this alternative system of the free association of producers? There are, of course, many possible things we could emphasize. In capitalist societies, as Marx emphasizes a lot in the first few chapters of Capital, private labors are validated as socially useful only ex post, that is, when their products are brought to market in exchange for money. People often work hard to produce goods and services only to find out retrospectively that their hard work serves no recognized or valid social purpose. And Marx describes all of these different experiences like that in the course of the first two chapters of Capital. And Marx seems to be suggesting, although he only ever says this implicitly, that an ex-ante planned distribution of labor time across associations in accordance with changing needs would resolve many of these issues before they arise, because labor would be immediately social rather than only validated as social later. Like many commentators on this part of Marx's argument, I believe Marx underestimated the difficulties involved in a system of static or short-run economic planning like the one he's describing here. And that's in large part because the transformation of the production process into what Marx calls a process of the technical application of scientific knowledge, which is something that Marx praised, didn't actually end up simplifying production. On the contrary, it made the requirements of the administration of social production much more complex and difficult to organize. However, and this is what I'm going to emphasize in my talk, throughout Capital, Marx makes many other claims about what a planned economy might be able to achieve, which have to do with long run rather than short run planning. That is to say, they have to do with investment rather than production for consumption. And what I want to say is that Marx provides many suggestions about how investment criteria, the criteria used to determine which investments are undertaken, would change in a socialist society. Of course, the majority of Capital is concerned with maturing capitalist societies, which have instituted limits on the working day. After those limitations are put in place, capitalists are forced to focus on the production of relative rather than absolute surplus value, and they invest in the mechanization of production, which has the effect of raising labor productivity. In making investment decisions in mature capitalist societies, capitalists focus on two things. First, they focus on maintaining or enhancing their control over the production process to ensure that the labor process remains first and foremost a valorization process. Second, they focus on enhancing the efficiency of production by saving on labor, materials, and other expenses in order to earn temporary super profits. And Marx has an interesting description of how that can also lead sometimes to an increase in the society-wide profit share of income. Capitalists don't need to take any account of the health, safety, or happiness of workers or of the fertility of the soil, or really of any other investment criteria. Over time, the accretion of investments, which Marx calls the accumulation of capital, transforms the character of production in these mature capitalist societies. And Marx summarizes his findings in the following way. He says, quote, "We showed in part 4, which is on large-scale industry and machinery, how the development of the social productivity of labor presupposes cooperation on a large scale, how instruments of labor which, by their very nature, can only be used in common, such as systems of machinery, can be called into existence, how gigantic natural forces can be pressed into the service of production, and how, I emphasize this, the production process can be transformed into a process of the technological application of scientific knowledge. These are potentially highly advantageous outcomes from the perspective of the human species. However, within capitalist societies, the consequences for workers and for the soil and the environment are extremely negative." These 2 pages, which in the English edition, I think of as like the concluding passages of Marx's analysis of the mature capitalist society, lays out many different negative consequences that the way capitalist societies develop labor productivity, the many different negative consequences that has for workers. So just to point out some of the highlighted passages here, he says, the higher the productivity of labor, the greater is the pressure of workers on the means of employment, the more precarious, therefore, becomes the conditions for their existence. So he's saying that, the more productivity rises, the lower the demand for labor is, and the more insecure and precarious workers feel. He also talks about how within the capitalist system, all means for raising the social productivity of labor come about at the cost of the individual worker. It distorts the worker into a fragment of a man, alienates him from the intellectual potentialities of the production process in the same proportion as science is incorporated as an independent power. They transform his lifetime into working time. And so Marx emphasizes that as accumulation of capital takes place, that implies the misery, torment of labor, slavery, ignorance, brutalization, and moral degradation of the worker. And what I want to say here is that implicit in Marx's argument are a number of criteria which would shape investment decisions in socialism. So, the major one is already there. He says that he's implying that in socialism will raise the productivity of labor, but in ways that do not come at the expense of the individual worker, that do not alienate him from his intellectual potentialities, do not transform his lifetime into working time. Elsewhere in the book, he emphasizes that, this other society wouldn't ruin what he calls the long-lasting sources of soil fertility. And throughout Capital, actually, he provides many clues about other investment criteria, although he often expresses it negatively. So, for example, he says the shortening of the working day, therefore, is by no means what is aimed at in capitalist production when labor is economized by increasing its productivity. By implication, a socialist society might focus on shortening the working day as an effect of, or as a way to take the gains of productivity. He says about, some other feature of production, it cannot be otherwise in a mode of production in which the worker exists to satisfy the need of the existing values for valorization, as opposed to the inverse situation in which objective wealth is there to satisfy the worker's own need for development. And of course, the implication is that in a socialist society, the notion that objective wealth should satisfy the worker's own need for development is taken or should be taken as a possible investment criterion. My argument would be that the greatest advantage of the association of free men working with the means of production held in common is that they can base their investment decisions on a much larger range of criteria. They can transform production into a process of the technological application of scientific knowledge, but with different goals than those that obtain under capitalism. Marx does not explain how free associations would do that, and I think he actually underestimates the difficulty involved in that as well. And in my research on this problem, I come to believe that the Marxist who saw the potentials and pitfalls of this feature of post-capitalist society most clearly was this Viennese Jewish positivist Otto Neurath, who is also, a founding member of logical empiricism and the unity in science movement and so on. But I think that his work has often been, or is typically very misunderstood. In a series of papers, Neurath made an argument something like this. He said, a society that takes as its goal only to raise productivity or to increase the efficiency of all productive activities can claim to work towards an objective technical optimum. So there's one best way to do things, and these societies are trying to achieve that. However, a society that has multiple criteria will converge towards no single optimal way to organize production. There is no objective way to determine a best plan. There are multiple options, and there's no way to determine in a technical sense which one is the optimal plan. Neurath argued that a post-capitalist society would therefore need to design planning institutions with two components. One is a technical component, which determines the set of feasible plans that are better than all other feasible plans evaluated across a range of criteria. Those criteria might include, efficiency, sustainability, work quality, so on and so on. And then a second democratic component would then follow a procedure for deciding which of these plans to actually carry out. And Neurath emphasizes the need for this democratic moment because there's no technical way to determine the best plan once these multiple criteria are taken into account. Problems with the specific proposal that Neurath made left him open to criticism by Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, and their criticism of Neurath launched the famous socialist calculation debate, which I talk about in the book I'm writing that this talk is drawn from. My work as an intervention into this debate focused on the potential to take on board a wide range of investment criteria within what I call post-scarcity society. And then I'm going to explain what I mean by that. And I'm going to kind of transition now to the second part of the talk, which introduces those ideas. So this is the introduction to this post-scarcity problem. The basic idea, this is be a little bit repetitive, but without reference to Marx, is that we live in a world beset by this problem of local rationality and global irrationality. Actors act in locally rational ways, but they add up to an irrational society at the global level. The reason for that is that our economy is organized largely in and through profit-making firms, which, although there's very much to criticize in their activity, perform their activity with a very mathematically precise logic. These businesses have two goals, slightly different from what I said before, and in a more contemporary idiom. Their goals are, one, to maximize the amount of income that they generate for every unit of capital they deploy. And their second goal is to ensure that as much of that income as possible ends up in the pockets of business owners rather than workers. And this is easily summarized by this classic Marxist equation that the profit rate, profit per unit capital, is equal to income per unit capital multiplied by profit per unit income. And there's a mistake in the next sentence, but it should say the profit rate or profit per unit capital is the product of two terms, income per unit capital and the profit share of income, which I just rewrite here. And a lot of people in our contemporary Marxist kind of world emphasize the second term, the profit share of income. And it's certainly true that there's been a major increase in economic inequality over the last 40 years. And so people focus on inequality in neoliberal societies. But I want to focus on the first term, which is income per unit capital. And that's also known sometimes as the maximum profit rate, the profit rate if there were no wages at all. If all of our problems could be solved by maximizing the income we generate from our resources and technologies, then I think that in some sense, our society would be at some level fundamentally rational. There would still be distributional issues, but the production system would be fundamentally rational. And in that sense, local rational action would generate globally rational outcomes. But in reality, in spite of enormous increases in capital and labor productivity, we are beset by problems of ecological devastation, poor quality of work, epidemics of loneliness and disconnection, in addition to poverty and economic insecurity. What I want to convince you of is that the major reason for this situation is that the requirement to produce as efficiently as possible, which is actually modified in mature capitalist societies in ways that I don't talk about in this presentation, this requirement to produce as efficiently as possible takes precedence over other goals that we might have in organizing our economy. These other goals include things like ensuring that people are securely able to meet their needs, that they have access to satisfying work and substantial free time, that people have access to meaningful human connections, and that all of this activity takes place in a way that is fair and sustainable, as well as highly efficient. Getting to a world where we allocate our resources so as to meet these many different goals would radically increase the complexity of the economic problem. We would need to figure out how to use our resources not only efficiently, but also sustainably, and also according to many other criteria. My claim is that capitalism cannot and has no interest in rising to this higher level of complexity. Capitalist economies are, of course, highly complex. They're organized in and through a complex division of labor, and they produce a bewildering array of goods and services. But they do so by following simple rules, at the heart of which is maximizing income per unit capital. By contrast, we would need to trade off that goal of maximal efficiency in the use of resources against a range of other goals. Seeing the world we're aiming at as achieving a higher order of complexity than what we currently have would help us avoid two traps in envisioning a better socialist future. In my view, the first trap is the idea that reorganizing, or I want to say first, that reorganizing the economy is not simply a matter of solving certain technical issues. It's not a mere computational problem. Nor, I believe, is reorganizing the economy a matter of re-embedding the economy in a community which has a set of shared values. Because achieving a higher level of complexity means, following the Neurath that I talked about before, that apparently technical questions take on more ethical and political dimensions. People will end up disagreeing about what to do and how to move forward. They will disagree about what the relevant criteria are, how to measure them, and how to trade them off against one another. And in that case, getting to a rational future in which local and global rationality coincide means modeling and experimenting with institutions that can organize this higher level of social complexity. And of course, getting there will not be easy. But if we can achieve that goal, then we can actually build a world where we use our human, natural, and technological resources to meet a wide variety of material, social, and psychological needs, while also satisfying many people's wants. We would live in a world where people feel more secure and connected and see life as an adventure, a gift, and a capacity to contribute to the happiness of others. Even beginning to understand what it would take to get there requires some initial thinking about conceptual frameworks, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today in this part of the talk. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is happiness. It's important to unearth the assumptions behind economic thinking today, not Marxist economic thinking, but neoclassical economic thinking. Because I think that many people have absorbed some of those ideas and they block us from seeing some very basic things about the world that we need to build. Economics rests on this common sense notion that even if money alone cannot make us happy, it nevertheless gives people access to the true sources of happiness. And what that means is that in this view, according to economists, the things we need to be happy are goods and services that we can buy. The challenge we face, according to this kind of economic reasoning, is that human desires for goods and services are insatiable. We always want more things than we have. We can always use more money than we have, according to that view, while the resources we have are always limited. The goal, according to these economists, is to figure out how to allocate our limited resources so as to satisfy as many desires or preferences as possible. Economics defines scarcity as the gap between our insatiable desires and our limited resources. And they argue that we can never overcome scarcity by definition, but by using our resources more and more efficiently, we can at least obtain more of what we want. The more we have available, and correspondingly, the more goods and services we can access, the happier we are. That's the fundamental theory that's on the first 10 pages of every economics textbook. But the problem is that this theory is just empirically false. Study after study shows that even as people in wealthier countries get richer, they do not report higher levels of happiness. And this is called the Easterlin paradox. So this is a very standard graph of this phenomenon. Researchers just ask a representative sample of people how happy they are. And as their incomes rise over time, there's essentially no change in the share of people that report happiness. So even though their incomes are growing and they can access more goods and services, it does not seem to produce the subjective feeling that economists claim that it should. Some economists try to resolve the paradox by saying that money does make us happier, but only on a logarithmic scale. In other words, what we need to do isn't just to increase people's incomes, but to double those incomes. If that were true, then the economy would need to grow at roughly 3% per year forever, because at 3% per year, the economy doubles in size every generation, every 24 years. Human happiness, if that were true, would come into conflict irreparably with two trends. One trend is the tendency of mature capitalist economies to stagnate, and the other trend is, of course, the emergent ecological limits to growth. A simpler and more accurate way to resolve the Easterlin paradox is to open ourselves to a multidimensional account of human happiness. So researchers who take this approach argue that raising incomes makes a big difference to people's happiness when they are poor, because having more when you're poor means being able to meet your basic needs more securely. After that point, the effect of raising incomes dramatically declines. People can satisfy more of their wants, but then they develop new ones. Many of the things that people want are positional goods, that is, things that are only worthwhile because a few people have them, or because very few people have them. And that process sets us up on what some research call the hedonic treadmill, that you always get more and more of what you want, but you never actually feel any better because of it. But in that case, we're speaking only about material needs, that is, for goods and services. But from this multidimensional perspective, people also have a range of social and psychological needs. These include needs for social support and love, for autonomy, for feelings of usefulness, and for meaning and purpose. And I think many of these things are the things that Marx himself was emphasizing in his analysis of the negative effects of rising productivity for workers in a capitalist society. The point is that these are not goods and services one can buy on the market, but they have major consequences for how happy people are. Whether people can meet these needs is affected by how we organize our economy, or how we organize our social provisioning system, which is how a lot of heterodox economists talk about the economy. If you take, for example, like the epidemic of loneliness among the elderly, this is a huge issue in actually, it's a particularly big issue right now in East Asia, I imagine in South Korea, certainly in Japan, and increasingly in the US and Europe as well, that old people are spending more and more time alone. It's having very negative effects on their health and is a potential major problem for increasing life expectancy further. But loneliness isn't a problem that you can solve with money. It's a problem you have to solve through social organization. One issue with shifting from a unidimensional monetary account of human happiness to a multidimensional account is that we cannot be sure what the sources of happiness are. We have to try to discover what they are, and then we disagree about them, and also about how to measure them and how to trade them off against each other. Researchers run into this problem when they seek to replace GDP as a measure of the wealth of societies or the income of societies with multiple other measures. How many items, they ask, should we include in a dashboard of societal well-being, and how do we weigh these different criteria against one another? I think that this is not a bug, but a feature, that once we arrive at this more multidimensional account, we lose the ability to find, as I emphasized with Neurath's work, some kind of objective technical optimum. Instead, we enter a world where all of these different things become incommensurable qualities, and we arrive at a world of value complexity. And I think of that as a very important thing to think about when Marx has sometimes talked about the abolition of value. What is really meant by that is the abolition of a single standard of value, which leaves us in a world with many values, but values which are incommensurable. They don't have a common unit that allows us to commensurate them. And this leads to my discussion of post-scarcity, what I mean by that. So the definition of scarcity that I've been using so far in this presentation comes from the British economist Lionel Robbins. Robbins, he didn't invent this idea of scarcity, but he proposed it as the definition of economics, or as its foundation, in his famous essay, An Essay on the Nature and Significance of Economic Science, which was published in 1932 during the Great Depression. Robbins was heavily influenced by the socialist calculation debate, which I mentioned earlier, which followed from the publication of von Mises' 1920 essay, Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. Robbins refers to that material in his book, and he defines economics specifically so as to exclude the possibility of a socialist economy, at least given his understanding from that debate. A crucial feature of Robin's argument in this essay is to attack the needs-wants distinction. He argues that we cannot distinguish between needs and wants for any one person or for the population as a whole. Robbins laid the foundations for the view, which is now very common in economics, that all there are preferences to be satisfied. There's no needs and wants, there's just preferences. And that was the basis on which scarcity was generalized into this universal and indeed eternal problem of the gap between our insatiable desires and our limited resources. On this conception, post-scarcity is understood to require a technological leap forward in our production capacities. So if our resources can become as unlimited as our desires, then everything will become free and we will solve the economic problem. So this conception of scarcity leads to this specific conception of post-scarcity as a world where our resources are as unlimited as our desires. And there's a very large science fiction literature on post-scarcity that I read a lot of and I find very fascinating. And the entire literature is about a paradox, which is that having unlimited resources in and of itself will not make us happy. We still experience conflict, even irresolvable conflict. All of the stories about post-scarcity worlds are about the persistence of human conflict and sadness in a world with unlimited resources. And what I want to say is that this genre of science fiction is essentially a meditation on the falseness of this unidimensional economic theory of happiness, which says that if we had unlimited resources, we would be able to fulfill all of our desires and to be truly happy. Recently, two social scientists revived an older conception of scarcity in a book called Scarcity: Why Having Too Little Means So Much. This older definition of scarcity, the term used to refer not to an ever-present condition, but rather an exceptional one. The idea was that during periods of disaster and calamity, things that we were taking for granted suddenly became unavailable. We no longer had access to the things that we needed. That was the original meaning of scarcity. Something would become scarce when something that was available was suddenly no longer available. And what these social scientists in this book showed is that not getting what you need has real measurable effects on people's experience. They become like laser focused on getting what they need but don't have. Their world shrinks down, like a person who's very hungry can only think about eating. Someone who has no money can only think about money. There are these real measurable effects on their ability to think about other things. It has all of these effects on what they focus on in situations. Like there's just many measurable consequences to experiencing scarcity. Correspondingly, when people do get secure access to what they feel they need, their worlds open up. They have more time and energy to think about and experience other things about life and about happiness beyond the fear that their fundamental needs will go unmet. In my view, drawing on this research, I would say that the 1960s were a time when the most people ever in history around the world simultaneously exited from the scarcity condition and also healed the scars that that condition leaves behind. There's a famous social scientist who described people's experience in the 60s as post-materialist. But I think what they really were was post-scarcity. It wasn't that they didn't care anymore about material things. It's that they took the meeting of their needs for granted. And that's what I think being beyond scarcity really means. And that's why I say that the real utopian core of the economic or technological vision of post-scarcity is this alternative social vision that's obscured within the way we talk about it. Having limitless resources like on Star Trek or in these other examples would improve people's lives primarily because they would never have to worry about meeting their needs. Their worlds would open up. They would never worry about how they're going to make money, how they're going to survive, where they're going to live. All of those things become easy and they don't think about it anymore. But getting to a world like that where no one worries about meeting their needs does not require science fiction levels of technology. And in fact, I say that seeing post-scarcity in these technological terms is at best a distraction. We might acquire these incredible technologies, but not actually use them to meet people's needs, in which case they won't result in a post-scarcity society in any meaningful sense. On the other hand, we also can meet everyone's needs in the world without having those kinds of technologies. At the same time, this kind of technological account of post-scarcity leads us to believe falsely that we need to meet everyone's last whim and wish in order to get out of the present society. But having unlimited resources wouldn't in and of itself achieve that goal in any case, because as I said, many of the things people want are status goods or unique experiences, and many needs are social and psychological rather than material. Robbins' efforts to obliterate or bury or erase the needs wants distinction, I think, ends up failing, but that doesn't mean that we can discern in some scientific and objective way what it is that people really need. There's not some technical objective way to say these are the needs that we need to meet, because people's needs clearly vary, and they vary personally, culturally, and historically, and people's needs also change over time. And that means, again, that the question of meeting people's needs is already a question that involves a lot of conflicts of different views and also implies a lot of complexity. There are cultural and political as well as economic matters. And so what we need to do is figure out what the social institutions are that would allow us to organize ourselves in such a way as to overcome scarcity for everyone in the social sense, or in other words, to build an anti-scarcity machine. And that leads to the last part of my talk, which is about this question of the transition to this kind of post-scarcity society. So one of the things that I want to emphasize is that we already have the technological capacities to get to a world where no one has to worry about their needs anymore, as long as we take needs to encompass material, social, and psychological needs at the same time. Getting to a post-scarcity world would represent an epochal transformation human species, which I think would be equivalent to the birth of agriculture or the formation of the state, but would happen on a much faster timescale. To live in a world where no one worries about their survival any longer, about getting what they need, would open up people's worlds and transform the experience of the human species. It might even mark a return, but at a higher level of complexity, to the common condition of our pre-scarcity foraging ancestors. And you can use this new way or this other way of thinking about scarcity to gain a better understanding of the research that Marshall Sahlins and others did into what they call Stone Age economics in the 1960s, because they also use this false Robbins-based theory of scarcity to think about what was going on. It's important to remember that even if the epochal threshold, even if the threshold of this transformation were crossed, people would still continue to experience many unmet wants. They would fail to acquire positional goods, and they would lose out on many unique, unrepeatable experiences. But that wouldn't make any difference to the question of whether they were able to transition to a world where they didn't have to worry about meeting their needs. The capitalist economy gets us some way towards crossing this post-scarcity threshold, but like a marathon runner inadequately trained, it gives out well before the finish line. Capitalist societies build housing, but not enough for everyone. They develop technical and human capacities, but leave very large numbers of people outside of this or with their fundamental needs unmet. Capitalism can't cross the finish line, and indeed doing so isn't its goal, and to speak of a goal of capitalism is imprecise, but there's two reasons for this. One, as I mentioned earlier, is that the engine of profitability gives out too soon. It gives out in mature capitalist societies, which tend to stagnate, leading to insecurity and instability. And the other problem, which I also mentioned, is that the pursuit of profitability, which I think of more in terms of these two terms, income per unit capital and profit per unit income, is incapable of helping us meet the wide variety of human needs that cannot be bought with money. We would be able to cross this finish line if we guaranteed everyone access to universal basic services and provided everyone with the basic income without any regard for how much they work. But doing so would require a lot of investment. And that is, again, this key term that I think is underemphasized in Marxist accounts of what Marx said about communism or socialism that I'm emphasizing here. And I focus on this term investment because it's a word that people frequently misunderstand because they associate investment with finance and monetary returns. Whereas in reality, the financial system is an inadequate means for organizing real investments. Real investments, as Marx emphasized in that quote that I started off the talk with, is the setting aside of a portion of our resources for the construction of things like housing, schools, hospitals, canteens, and playgrounds, and then also the resources for actually building those things. Investment isn't just building those things, but also outfitting them with specific equipment and machines and software that they require for their day-to-day operations. And an important point is that investment takes time, often years, to complete, and it's always a bet on an uncertain future. If it takes 5 years to build something and bring it up to speed operationally, you have to imagine that the needs, capacities, and technologies and tastes that people have will be more or less the way that's expected when the project is finished. And that creates a lot of uncertainty and a lot of difficulty in undertaking investment. But once we build things, then they're there and we can use them. Investment is, when we think about it, we should think about it as transforming the sum total of our capacities, determining what will be easy to do and what will be hard to do in the future. And the accretion of all the investments undertaken so far is, in some sense, our real material wealth, or the wealth of a society. The question of transition to a post-scarcity society or a post-capitalist society or a socialist society is in large part a question of how to organize this investment process outside of the normal financial channels. And I emphasize that because it's important to think about proposals that Keynesians make and that formerly Keynesians and Stalinists made about how a transition like that would be undertaken. Keynes proposes that there should be a single national investment board with a professional staff that operates at a distance from parliamentary oversight. His proposal from his late works, actually throughout his life, about this national investment board is highly technocratic in character. And he's very famous for having recognized the problem of uncertainty, but not at all the problem of value complexity. Keynes supposed that the real needs that people have, material, social, and psychological, can be easily and simply known. So in 1942, on an essay on investment, he famously said that what people want is, quote, the dignity of an ancient university or European capital, an ample theater, a concert hall, a dance hall, galleries, cafes, and so forth. And I think this is a very silly idea because it assumes that we can simply know what it is that people want. Keynes's proposal makes no room for the real meaningful conflicts that people have over what their needs are, how to measure success in meeting them, and how various goals that people have should be traded against one another. I think that Cory Doctorow, in a way, in his science fiction novel Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, is much more realistic when he suggests that people who have unlimited resources and who never die will nevertheless engage in very meaningful conflicts over what happens to specific rides at Disneyland, because what matters to them is the meaning and historical significance of their actions, not just whether they can be repeated. So, as I said before, the question of how to get to this post-scarcity world, as well as the question of the institutions that govern it, come down to the question of how the investment process that leads us there will be organized. It has to be efficient and fair while making space for complexity, and it has to have some way of dealing with the twin problems of technically determining what is possible to do and then having a democratic decision about which of the options to take, which is also how Neurath thought about the problem. I'm not going to describe, how I think those institutions should be organized, but I'm just trying to lay out some conceptual framework. So this is just the conclusion. I think that we could get to a post-scarcity world, and we could do it in a single generation of about 25 years. Getting there would require not just massive works of construction, but also research and development, of invention and innovation. If history is a guide, it would likely take another 10 years for the scars of scarcity to heal among all these people who've lived for so long without their needs being met. And a crucial part of the argument, which I skipped in the interest of time, but it turns out I actually would have had long enough to talk about it, is that, as Marx emphasized in those quotes that I brought out at the beginning, we would have to change not only how we meet our needs, but also how we work. People would need a lot more autonomy in how they carry out their tasks, opportunity to use their and develop their skills and their intellectual capacities. And they would need to work in a way that gives them a sense that the work they do is meaningful or serves a real social purpose. We'd have to organize and transform the way that we work. And again, that's really important because it's a criteria of investment that can't be reduced to the efficiency with which we produce things. And of course, you know, as Marxists have always emphasized, this would require not just a new set of institutions, but a battle with the capitalists who control the investment process currently. But in addition to that battle, it would require the development of an institutional framework that could govern a complex, uncertain, and conflictual transition. And so I do think that this is possible, that it would transform the conditions of life of the species. So that's my talk. I hope it was clear enough and certainly on time, within time. So there you go. Thanks.
Thank you for your presentation, Professor Benanav. Yes, it's a very interesting presentation. He talked about Marx's idea on the production and investment in the post-capitalist society, and standpoint for investment I mean happiness with complex and diverse need, and the importance of overcoming the concept scarcity in the social sense. Yeah. Okay. Anyone who has questions or discussion on his talk, please raise your hand or let me know by chat. Maybe the people have to take some time, so why don't we have coffee break? 5-time coffee break, okay? Good. Then we start in 5 minutes. Okay.
Good.
Okay, now we start. Mm,
I have a question.
yes,
Uh,
please.
I think 25 years seems like a pretty specific numbers. Can you tell me what kind of process you have in mind when you say 25 years?
Yeah, I guess that I mean that's obviously like a bit exaggerated. Like, but I guess my point is that I don't think it would take that long to do it. That it would be a long-term project, but it wouldn't be like a century-long project because I think we do have the capacity to do it. I think that a lot of people, thinking about how long it would take to transition the economy to a green economy, also think it would take, about that long. So I'm just emphasizing that I don't think it will take 5 years or 100 years, but something in the middle. And I basically think that things like 5-year plans and dynamic planning, like they did in the Soviet Union in the first in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and also in Japan, and in China more recently, even maybe in some ways in South Korea's history, that kind of dynamic planning is incredibly powerful. And the idea is to use those kinds of powers to do things besides just trying to increase the scale of production and to produce heavy and chemical industry, but really to use those kinds of capacities for planning to meet all of these other goals, like to reduce the amount of time that people work, to green production, to make the work that people have to do more inherently enjoyable, that those are all things that we could use this kind of planning for, that were never part of the 5-year plans of the 20th century in some way, but could be part of a kind of long run program of a different kind of socialist society that had these many criteria as its goals.
I have a question. Your talk helped me to revisit the concept of scarcity and to think about the foundations of how to run an economy in a post-capitalist society. My question is this: how can we democratically organize production and investment at the social level to meet people's diverse, complex, and possibly disagreeable needs? Not only did Marx himself provide a concrete picture of what an alternative economy would look like, but subsequent advocates of alternative economies seem to have been unable to come up with a generalized position on this democratic process, and I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, I guess that my view is that a lot of the efforts to solve that problem were very focused on achieving like general equilibrium solutions to the problem of like short run or static allocation. So they're mostly concerned with the question of like, if we're going to make all of these nails and screws, like who makes those, and then who are they sent to? And I think that essentially a lot of the focus of those projects is on, like short run exchange issues or short run planning issues. And they tended not to emphasize the long run investment issue as the primary question. And I think that that's much more the primary question. I think that in a lot of ways, when people read Marx, there's a focus on the first few chapters of Capital, which are about markets and exchange, rather than on the later chapters, which are all about accumulation and investment. And, when we talk about capitalism as being guided fundamentally by profitability, you can think about that in terms of like the short run questions of how, markets are organized, but also this long run question of investment and like the directional developmental course of society. And so in my, reading of those debates, the only person who really talks about the primacy of the long run criteria is Pat Devine who wrote this book on democracy and economic planning. And I think that book is really much closer to solving the problems compared to other ones, because I don't think that I guess that I think that efficiency of allocation is important, but the way that capitalism works is by constantly generating overproduction and underproduction. It's not actually a system that privileges what economists call static allocative efficiency, because the whole point of investment is to constantly waste resources in the search of higher levels of dynamic efficiency or productivity. And I think that those are some of the ways that, trying to take a neoclassical model and kind of rebuild, like to build a socialist economy that can do what the neoclassical model does is very distracting as far as what the actual features are of capitalism that we need to theorize and to replace. I don't think I have a really great solution to the static allocative problem. I think that, in practice, people end up advocating something that's a mixture of markets and plans. I think that there's a lot more to be said about that, but I think that the very long period of focusing on that was in some ways a mistake. And that, even in the socialist calculation debate, there was a tendency to focus on these short run static allocative questions rather than long run dynamics. And really the things that, powered the Soviet Union were not markets versus plans, but the fact that they had these, that they invented a new way to do long run investment that involved getting prices wrong, and projecting future scales of production and, increasing the scales of production of all of these different activities simultaneously in a way that had nothing to do with, getting prices right and then allocating resources on that basis. And I think that's also an accurate description of how a lot of, capitalism works. Even today, like venture capital does not invest in companies based on their profitability. They invest in them based on a long range projection of their future scale. So I just think that there's a lot of mistakes involved in taking neoclassical economics at its word. And yeah, like I said, I guess my emphasis in the first part of the talk was really about how, I think Marx has a lot to say about investment criteria in the book Capital, and I to my knowledge, I don't really think that's emphasized in the literature interpreting what he says about socialism, but it might be that I have not read enough of that literature. But in a lot of the stuff that I read, that part of it is not really emphasized.
Thank you. Yes, Professor Jeong.
Aaron, thank you very much. It's a really great talk. I think your this morning's talk is very important, especially is your argument about the post-scarcity society as an alternative to capitalism. I think it's very important, because usually in a Marxist tradition, post-scarcity society is assumed to be a higher phase of communism, and it is a rather easier task to advance to that higher phase of communism. So a difficult task is to achieve the socialism. That means the lower phase of communism, because only after if we achieve this lower phase of communism, socialism, then we can advance to the higher phase of communism, is a post-scarcity society, thanks to the development of productive forces liberated from the limitations of capitalism. So it is just a job of technical issues. But you, I think, very importantly and correctly emphasize that it's advancing to the post-scarcity society is not so easy in the, especially as you mentioned, the issue of positional goods or the the experience that are very hard to repeat. So it is very difficult. So it cannot be achieved only thanks to the development of productive forces. So it should be designed. It should be, and also in that respect, investment is very important. So I think that and as you indicated, that Marx himself did not consider that respect is sufficiently. I think and also you think that you argue that the task of achieving the post-scarcity society should be started right now. So even in the present capitalist conditions, by using the means, by using the universal basic incomes like that. So it cannot be postponed to the distant future. So I think that is very important. So my question is that while I agree with your points, it looks that you you are distancing from the traditional Marxist concept of socialist planning. I agree that existing Marxist socialist planning models mostly is unidimensional, as you rightly indicated, and also it fails to consider the diverse, it's a complexity issues. But I think Marx model of socialism, that is, I think, is a labor time calculation model. I think it is still very important I think it's very useful for us to design it's an alternative to capitalism. And I also think that now it's thanks to the development of the technologies, as you know, like the big data or the artificial intelligence, or like the ChatGPT, we may even we can develop its planning or its participatory planning using the labor time calculation, even considering the diverse needs and the complexities. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you for all of that. I think that was very useful to situate what I was saying and to think about some of these questions. And I think that I think that you're right that we can use these new advanced technologies to achieve that kind of planning. And I think, you know, and participatory planning. And I think that there's nothing wrong with, I mean, in at a basic level, it's simply true that, you know, if we want to change the supply of various goods, we need to reallocate labor time, you know, across the system. I mean, that's also what capitalism achieves with markets. So there's no way to think about what we need to do outside of that framework of the, you know, having a planning system that allows us to reallocate labor across different activities in order to change what we produce in line with changing needs. I think that the thing that I have an issue with is just when that is seen as when that idea is like seen as the same as saying that the most efficient use of our labor resources is the goal. Because I don't think that I think, you know, what I was trying to show with those passages from Marx from volume 1 is that I don't think that's what he's saying. I think that's very contrary to what he's saying, because capitalism is a society that privileges, you know, efficiency in the use of labor above all of these other goals. But Marx's whole point is that if you only care about that, then you will produce a world where human beings are fragmented, you know, in essential ways in which their intellectual potentials are not used in their work and their lifetime becomes work time. And, you know, that, I think those things are very important to Marx. And I don't think that he intended them to be delayed to some higher stage of communism. I think he imagined those things to be things that a socialist society could very quickly begin to change, you know. But that might mean, for example, like that, you know, not doing things in the most technically efficient possible way, because it means balancing the need for efficiency against a whole range of other things that also matter. And I think that the point for Marx is that if we don't have market society and we don't have the pressures of competition and we don't have profitability guiding these decisions, then we could very quickly begin to start investing in the means of production in a way that changes all of these things about our lives. And I don't think there's anything in the text that implies that that has to be like a very far future goal. How we achieve that, of course, will be a matter of, like you said, reallocating labor time, you know, across activities in line with changing needs. But what those needs are, I think Marx emphasizes again and again, are a much more expansive conception. And so in the second part of my talk, and, you know, I'm just working on, it's very new and I didn't connect it together well enough, but I think that Marx has this very multi-dimensional account of human needs, and in contemporary discussions, often not happening among Marxists, but among other people in our society, there's a beginning of this understanding. And what's very interesting to me is that these multi-dimensional accounts of human happiness often emerge out of critiques of economics, you know, out of critiques of the unidimensional, essentially value-based character of contemporary economics. And I find that very fascinating, because I think that in some ways it gets back to these, you know, these insights that Marx in his critique of value was trying to emphasize. So I hope that that makes sense. Like, I don't think there's any contradiction between what I'm saying and this idea of a planned reallocation of labor time. Like I was saying, I just think it's a very complex problem. And I think Marx underestimated that complexity. I think when you say, you know, with big data, artificial intelligence, and ChatGPT and other tools like that, we could do it, you know, that's a way of speaking to how difficult that is, that the incorporation of science into production made those things a lot more difficult than Marx, I think, imagined. But the point is what we use that to do and what we conceive the needs as, you know, that we need to meet. So I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah.
I'm sorry that the
Okay.
talk, I should have connected what I was saying more to all of these debates. You know, I usually don't speak to people who are so well-versed in all of the debates about post-capitalism. Obviously, this group knows a lot more about that. So I could have emphasized a lot more, you know, why what I'm saying is, to me, like more related to this Pat Devine, like kind of tradition of thinking about planning as an investment problem, you know, and having a little bit of criticism of like some other models that I think don't emphasize enough that long range character. So I apologize for not making those connections clear.
Oh, you are welcome. Yes, in relation to that, what do you think about the the school that I mentioned? Is the scholar's name is Cockshott and Cottrell. As
Yeah,
so, it looks that you are critical of their models. And the second, I also, as you are the editor of the New Left Review, I recently read articles. Is written Mozharov.
Yeah,
Mozharov. Yeah.
yeah.
What what do you think of because he is also in the tradition of Cockshott and Cottrell.
Yeah, I think Cockshott and Cottrell is a very good example because they really do take a neoclassical model of general equilibrium and explain how you can achieve that result with, you know, linear programming and input-output tables. And I think it's really interesting. It's fascinating, and you know, I think a lot could be said about it. I think one of the big problems with it is that it isn't very good, or as far as I know, they haven't really described what happens in the event that, you know, producers are unable to produce what they're meant to produce in the plan. Because in reality, if you look at the Soviet Union, there were many reasons why it became, you know, that it didn't work very well. But one reason is that it was very difficult to secure the, you know, firms often, I mean, workplaces often didn't produce what they were supposed to, and they didn't send it to people, and that creates huge problems for something like that. But I think that what I'm trying to emphasize is the bigger problem is that it is there is a model that just says our goal is to efficiently use resources as efficiently as possible to maximize Y over K, you know. That is their goal, is to maximize the amount of income, the amount of output we can produce given our resources. And I think that's an important goal, but I think that's a misunderstanding of Marx's idea. And I think it's very hard to read those passages that I was emphasizing and not get the sense that, you know, it's very hard to read those passages without coming to the conclusion what the needs are that we need to meet are more diverse. They're not simply needs for goods and services. And I was in a meeting with them, and I did say to them that they don't really think about the Easterlin paradox, which they do know about. That, you know, there's no reason to believe that what they're talking about will actually make people happier. There's no evidence that that is the correct way to think about the problems of our society. So you also asked about, Morozov writes about Soros. I think that book's very interesting because it's trying to use computers and digital production to develop a planning model that is just very different. You know, it's not the same as the Leontiev input-output tables. It's a very different thing. I don't really think that it would work, but I do think that what I do take from it is this division between two forms of currency. Like in his model, there's a producer token that's used to organize the production system, and then a consumer token that's used to organize the consumption system. And I think that that is, in the book I'm writing, which also has a model of socialism, that's like a crucial part of it, that you can have, you know, with digital technologies, you can have multiple tokens that serve different functions in the system. And you can break the connection between the token that organizes production and the token that organizes consumption, which means that there's no, there isn't profitability in that sense in his model, because you can't retain production tokens and then use them to purchase consumption goods. And his model is also loosely based on the Devine model, in which there's a democratic process that governs investment. So I think some of that stuff is very interesting, but I want to have a model where, which has this conception of these multiple social, psychological, and material needs, and also has planning. So we'll see. I'll let you know when I have something more concrete to share on that.
Thank you very much for your very kind answers. Thank you.
Okay, is there more comments or questions? No?
That's okay. It is late here. So.
Okay, I think it's time to finish our talk. Do you want to make a closing comment, Professor Benanav?
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's Sungjin, it's really good to see you again. And I'm gonna, hopefully in June, I'm gonna go to Japan and meet Kohei and, you know, some other people that I know you all work with. So so in any case, please stay in touch, and thank you for inviting me. Yeah, it's really good to see you.
Again, thank you for your great presentation and time, Professor Benanav. And thank you all.
Thank you.